Hello everyone, Matt from Model Minutes here, and welcome to this Build With Me series featuring the 1/72nd scale Supermarine Spitfire Mark 1A. So join me as I show you how I built this model kit, and feel free to put this video on in the background and build along with me. So without any further ado, let's get into it. So hopefully by the end of this video series, you should have a model which looks something like this. And in this first episode, I'm going to show you the basics on how to get started and to get familiarized with your kit. I have already built the Hawker Hurricane model kit, and that went into quite a deep dive. So let's assume you've seen some of that video. So I'm not going to go too deep into what this kit is. So this is the starter set version. You may have a slightly different version, which does or does not come with paint. So please make sure you read what it says on the box. On the back here, we've got our painting and decal placement instructions. So make sure you don't do anything with this box. Keep a hold of it. So inside this box, we should have some glue, a paintbrush, and some paints. As we go through this build, I will end up using a few extra bits and pieces. And some tools that you might want to get extra are some snips, a knife, and a sanding stick, just to get yourself going. You might want to get some more paints and some more brushes as well if you want to. But the stuff that's included in this kit should, at the bare minimum, bring you up to a basic standard of constructing the model. So let's get inside the box and briefly introduce the various elements that we have. So first up, we've got our instructions, which are definitely worth reading in their entirety before you start building the model. There are some extra hints and tips in here on things that I may or may not cover during the build. And then make sure you familiarize yourself with what's actually being told to you in these steps. So for example, in here, we've got part numbers, which are in the circles, and then paint numbers. So it also tells us how to paint our pilot and the internal cockpit areas as we move along. So just make sure you give a full read of all of these steps before you get to them. Also, pay attention to these various steps here with the question marks, as they are optional steps. So in this build in particular, you can either have the landing gear raised or lowered, but that is a decision that you're going to have to make before you get to that point, because if you don't, you can't then go back and change it. So the next thing to look at are the decals, and they come with a little bit of tracing paper which sits on the top just to protect them. Now these are water slide transfers, they're not stickers. I will show you how to apply them in this video, but you must take care of these because like I said, they're not stickers and they can be a little bit tricky at times. This set came with a number 2 thickness brush. These brushes are generally okay, but I will need to give it a bit of a wash to activate the nib there. So we'll put that away until we need it. We have a bag of paints. So make sure you check your paints. There was a small issue with the Humbrol pots in that they didn't quite seal correctly and the paints were drying out. So I'm going to give them a quick check. If you haven't got wet paint, so that's wet, that's usable, I will need to add a bit more water to it. If you haven't got wet paints, make sure you speak to the spares department at Airfix to get some new ones sent out to you. But for the moment, these all are wet so far, and I will be able to use them. The other little thing that we've got here is a tube of poly cement. This is the glue that we're going to use to assemble our model. If you want to use other poly cement such as Tamiya or Revell, they are effectively the same. Just in a slightly different format. So this will do the job, but there are better glues out there. This is effectively a little cheap one. And then finally in this bag, we have our plastic parts. So our plastic parts, we have 2 sprues of grey parts and 1 sprue containing a clear part. Make sure you keep an eye on where all these things are so that you don't lose them. And just looking at these parts here, you can see that all of the parts that we want are molded onto the frames with these little gates here. So we're going to have to cut them away eventually. But feeling the plastic, it feels a little bit oily. When they manufacture the kits, they use a mold release agent. It's a bit like when you do some baking and you use butter or oil to prevent food from sticking to your pans or baking trays. It's the same sort of deal when they come to mold plastic parts. So it feels a little bit greasy. I think the paints will struggle to stick to that. So the very first step I'm going to do with my kit, once I've made sure I've got all of the parts, is to give it a quick wash. So what I've got here is a pot of warm soapy water, just normal dish soap. I'm going to add a drop of vinegar into the mix because the acid in that will help break down some of the dirt and grime that we have on our plastic parts. Give it a good mix, and I've got this is an old toothbrush, and I'm going to use that to clean our plastic parts. So straight into your soapy mix, give it a good scrub, and then leave it to dry. And it's as simple as that. Do that to all of your parts, making sure you take care to not lose any in the process. Some of them are quite small. It is possible that you could knock them off and they fall into the tub. So just make sure before you pour the water away, you check the tub to make sure none of the plastic parts have inadvertently got stuck in the pot. If you lose a part, you can contact the spares department and get a new one possibly, but it is easier to just avoid losing them in the first place. It is something I've done in the past. So I'm going to leave these parts to air dry, and then I will be back with you. So my plastic parts are nearly dry, so we'll start doing some stuff with them in a minute. I think it's worth mentioning that this build will be based at a sort of beginner level of skill, but if you're an intermediate modeler, there might be some hints and tips in here for you. The paints then, so you only get 4 paints included in this kit, and we are going to be painting the internal parts of our model in this first episode. We've got a green, a sky type colour for the underside, that's Humble 90, a dark brown, and a matte black. All of these are going to require a bit of a mix, and maybe even thinning down with a little bit of water to get them to flow properly. If this is all you've got, then fair enough, crack on and do the build of these. However, over time, if like me, you've built a few models, you've got a few starter sets, and you've done a few things under your belt, you may end up with a few more paints and things to choose from. So during this build, I may dip into this box and find a more appropriate colour or something else that we can use in order to do things with, but it will be only a small amount of paint here and there. So you can see I've got lots of different colours, from reds, greens, blues, yellows, blacks. I think there's even some metallic colours in here as well. So if I use a colour that you don't feel you have to rush out to the shop and get one just so you can finish the model. Just keep it in mind for next time. It is a good idea when modelling to have a selection of paints, just generic colours, browns, greens, blacks, blues, sort of base colours, and some metallic ones. I'd suggest sort of some copper colour ones or some metallic ones, which I've probably got some metallic like silver. I think there's a silver in there. So the silver one, for example, will be fantastic for doing the landing gear legs and the wheels. But yeah, so as we go through, if I haven't quite got the right colour, I might end up mixing something as well. So let's see how that works out. So let's now start taking our parts away from our sprues. So I want all of the interior cockpit parts. So all I'm going to do is just very carefully nip them off with my cutters, taking care not to break them. And then once I've done that, all I'm going to do is sand down those little rough bits or excess plastic that I don't want with my sanding stick, just on the edges there, just to make it look a little bit tidier. Also, it will help them fit into their relevant slots and holes on the model as we go through and build it. So I need the various parts, including the bulkheads for the cockpit, and I also need to find the pilot and put him here as well. So I've got him. Just make sure you're not cutting off actual bits of detail, you're just cutting off the sprue gates which are holding the parts onto the frames. Just take your time to do this, there's no rush. It might be worth getting a small plastic pot or a little box to put these parts in once you've cut them away from the sprue, just so you don't lose them and you know where they all are. So now I've cut off my fuselage halves because we're going to paint the insides of those, and I've got these various components here, which are all for the inside of the cockpit, including the pilot. So it's up to you whether you include the pilot, it's completely your choice, but I am going to include him in this build. So I think that's the first one we're going to paint. There is a little bit of flash. So flash is extra plastic which shouldn't be there, which is left over from the molding process. So usually the molds are two-part molds, and the plastic, when it's injected into the mold, will seep between the two molds and leave extra plastic, and that's called flash. So what I'm going to do with my pilot figure is I'm going to take a little bit of this sticky tack and put it on the underside, and then stick a cocktail stick underneath him. So that gives me a relatively good way of being able to paint him as long as he stays on the stick. First up, we're going to use the dark earth brown paint, and I've been mixing it for a couple of minutes now just to make sure that it's been reactivated and is actually the color it's supposed to be. So we've got a nice brown color there. So this color is going to be painted onto our pilot, primarily the jacket and the trousers. So I'm using it straight out of the pot. I haven't bothered to thin it down. It's quite a thin paint already by the looks of it. Humbrol have changed their formulas in recent years, so it's not as thick and gloopy as it used to be. Just take your time with it, using your brush, just carefully paint the jacket and trousers. What I'm going to do with his goggles, I'll paint them black with the included black paint in a minute. And I'm going to probably dig into my extras box and find a flesh color for his face. So I'm going to wait for this paint to dry and then give him a second coat of this brown, because it's not quite covering enough as it is. Whilst I've got the brown paint out, I'm also going to apply it to the backrest of the chair for the cockpit. The rest of the cockpit area is going to be painted in a green colour. So we'll just get that bit in brown to sort of represent leather. Just going to put the black on the boots whilst we're waiting for the brown to dry. Just trying to make good use of my time. The black is a little bit thicker. It may only require one coat depending on how much you put on. This small part that I've got in my hand, this is the control panel. So I'm going to paint the top part of it here black as well, in preparation for the transfer. There's one decal which needs to go on this bit in a minute. So we'll do that before we effectively build this bit together, because it's so much easier to do it now than later. So just paint the top part here, the top flat bit, and also the reflector gun sight in black. This will probably need 2 coats because the paint isn't as thick as I thought it was. Moving back to the pilot, I've picked up a flesh colour, which is number 61 from my spares, or my stash as it were, and I'm using a very fine brush. Obviously, if you don't have a very fine brush, you could use a toothpick or a sharpened bit of plastic to apply your paint very carefully, but just a very, very tiny amount onto the face. You could, I suppose, even try mixing up some of the Humbrol 90, which is the sky type colour, and the brown, which you've got in the kit, to make a flesh kind of colour. But yeah, that'll do. There's my pilot. My pilot's pretty much ready. The life vest, if you wanted to go further, could be painted in yellow as well, to make him stand out if he ever has to jump out of his plane and go land in the sea. But as far as the starter set is concerned, this is pretty much your basic standard of how the pilot's going to look. So I mentioned earlier we've got a decal which needs to go onto the control panel, and it's this black one down here, number 6. So what I'm going to do is just cut it out from the paper, from the rest of them, and put the rest somewhere safe so I've got them. So what I've got here is a old plastic pot with some clean warm water in it, and my decal is going to go straight into there and soak up some water. It's only going to go in there for maybe 10-15 seconds. If you leave it in there too long, the transfer will start to peel away from your backing paper, and then it will start floating around in there, which isn't great. So we're just going to let the water do its magic put it on a bit of paper towel to soak up any excess. And then when it's ready, it will start to move, which is not quite ready yet. So we'll leave it a little bit longer. It might need a little bit more water, so just dip it back in if it does. Keep an eye on it. And then in a minute, that'll be ready to come off and we'll put it onto our model. So now it's moving around on the paper. So I'm going to take it off on my brush and very carefully, this is our control panel part. I'm going to put it in the correct place on the control panel part. You may need to use something with a pointy end like this cocktail stick just to get it in the right place. Just move it around. If it's not moving around too freely, just put some water underneath it. Just put a little bit of water on the part to help it move around. There are decal setting solutions out there in the modeling world, and what these things do is to help the decals soften down onto the plastic parts. It can make them look like they've been painted on. So there's loads of different ones out there. My normal go-to favorites are Microscale, Microset and Sol. It's a 2-part application process. Or you can use something like Humboldt Decal Fix. I know Tamiya do one. I'm pretty sure Rev will do one. There's loads. Absolutely loads of different decal setting solutions out there. So if you've got one, fantastic. Use it as per your manufacturer's instructions. If you haven't, not a massive deal. The decals in this set are from Cartograph and they are absolutely fantastic. So they should go onto the model without any real dramas. So just leave it now to settle down into the plastic, and don't be tempted to mess around with it too much, because you will run the risk of taking that transfer off of there. So leave it for like an hour just to settle down. If you are going to handle this part, be very careful and hold it where the transfer isn't, because otherwise it will come away in your finger. So the next step then is a bit of assembly. So it's the first bit of assembly we've done. I'm going to use my cocktail stick from earlier as my glue application tool. So open up your poly cement. Be careful, sometimes pressure likes to build up inside there. You can see the glue is starting to come out a little bit. Put a bit on the end of your cocktail stick and you're going to use that to apply it. So what we need to do is get our base for our cockpit, and I'm going to glue on the end here the frame for the bulkhead. I'm not entirely sure what this part is called, but it goes into its little slot quite neatly there on the back. Once that bit's done and it's snapped into place, just be super careful whilst you're handling these parts. You might want to go and get yourself some tweezers. Tweezers can be really handy for maneuvering small parts around as you build them. The chair, I would say, is the next part. So I'm going to be a little bit lazy here, but the chair goes onto these 4 mounting points. One there, one there, one there, and one there. So blobs of glue on there, taking care. And then we put our chair on here. Some of you might be wondering in the comments, you might be saying, oh, why haven't you painted all of these parts first? And the reason for that is because the glue will bond better if there's no paint on the parts. So if I had painted them, I would have had to gone through and remove paint from the various bonding surfaces. So this way, it means that I get a nice solid meld or weld effectively of the cement. The next part to add is the control column, which goes in a tiny little hole on the bottom in the middle there. There it is. Make sure you put it the right way round. It should be facing the pilot like that. He says, easier said than done. Our control panel part, which we painted previously, and it gets glued onto this mounting point here and this mounting point here. So a little bit of glue's on there. Obviously take care, my transfer hasn't quite settled down completely. So I'm going to be super careful to not dislodge it and get it in the right place. There we go. I'm just going to put that down and let the glue do its thing for a moment. And then we're going to start painting some stuff. What it is worth probably doing at this moment in time, there is a small part which needs to go on this little hole here. So I'm going to put a little bit of glue on there. And it's the tanks here. These, I think they're oxygen tanks for the pilot. And they mount onto the back there. So just going to do that. So they are now in the correct place on your fuselage. And effectively now what we've got to do is paint the fuselage interior and add our pilot and then glue it together. And that's the end of this episode. That will be the finishing point for this episode. So let's move on to that. So the cockpit interior, it doesn't actually tell you in the instructions what color to paint it, but from experience, I know that it's a kind of green. It's a lighter green than the green we're given in the actual set. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix these up, make sure that they're thoroughly mixed as they should be. And then I'm going to do a bit of color matching with the paint that we've got in the set. So I'm going to take a bit of the green, the dark green, for which is part of the camouflage scheme. It's too dark at the moment to be a good match for the paint that should be used in the cockpit of the Spitfire. So I'm going to put some of that in my pot. I need a bit more than that. And then this is the sky underside color. And I'm going to use some of this, again, once we've mixed it all up. Get a good color on that. I'm going to use some of that to lighten up our existing green. So pop some of that in my mixing pot. Close that down. I'm getting it all over myself, these pots. Honestly, that's horrendous, isn't it? I'll be right back after I've washed my hands. And now that I'm clean enough to continue, I'm going to mix these two paints together. And that is much better. That is more like a cockpit interior green. You could go a little bit lighter than that. There's no exact science. It's down to your own personal preference. But that is a bit better than what we started with. There is a little bit of water. You can see that in my pot there. I like this pot because it has a sort of convex shape to it. So water pools around the edges from previous washing or whatever I've been using it for. So if I need to grab some water to help thin the paint a little bit, I can. But it's only like a drop at a time, which is really good. So all I'm going to do is simply brush it on the interior areas of the cockpit. So that's on both sides of the fuselage. We're going to do this one here. We're going to do this one over here. So all of this inside area here is going to be painted. And I'm also going to do any bit here, he says, anything on here which is still grey. So anything on this cockpit interior part which is still grey will have to be painted in this cockpit green colour. Do take your time, do take care and patience. We've already painted the control panel and the chair, and we've put our transfer on this one, so you just be careful that you don't get your green paint inadvertently on there. So that's just a bit of patience, bit of time. There's no rush, there's no need to go ahead and just throw loads of paint on here either. Just a little bit of paint on your brush at a time is enough to do the job. Here is our internal cockpit parts, and there's only just one more bit I want to do, and that's just to paint the very top of the control column in black. So using my very fine brush from earlier, I'm just going to use some black paint on there and touch up any bits that I've missed there. So again, if you haven't got a very fine brush, a cocktail stick would be good enough to do that. I do have a silver paint from a previous project, so I'm going to use that here. In the instructions, it tells you that these gas canisters for the oxygen are to be painted black, but I'm pretty sure on the actual aircraft they were an aluminium colour. So I'm going to use an aluminium, seeing as I've got one. If you don't have one, you know, feel free to use the black. So just carefully painting them in silver. Before we can start adding everything together, we just need to make sure that the paint is dry. But before we can glue the fuselage together, we do need to assemble our propeller parts, because they need to be put in before the fuselage is closed so that they can rotate freely when the model is completed. So, relatively simple way of doing this is to press the end in here. I'm going to add a tiny amount of glue, although I probably should wait first, actually. We'll wait until we get to the fuselage part. Oh no, we can probably do it now. You just need to make sure you get the right distance when you push that on there. So I'll put a tiny amount of glue on the end of my backing plate. So this flat bit with a protrusion is our backing plate. Tiny bit of glue on there. And then we push on our retaining part. And this is going to set it up so that it doesn't stop it from rotating freely. So now we need to press that down. It's a little bit tight. Push it down. And it needs to go so that we can have it rotating freely in there. That's probably a little bit too far out at the moment, so we need to push it a bit further. Just take your time and check your distance as you go. Closer, maybe another millimeter. So that's probably close enough, I think. So that should rotate nice and freely when it's installed in the model. And then the next bit to do would be to glue on our prop. The actual propeller goes on and it slots into its little grooves. And then a little bit more glue around the outside. And we put on our spinner, which goes over the top like that. So there you go. So propeller is now assembled, and that's ready for being added into our model in a minute. Now it's time to add our pilot. So it's always a good idea to test fit your parts before you assemble them, just to check. And you can see here that the pilot is ever so slightly too big. And the reason why is because in real life, pilots, people, are a bit squishy and they conform to the space in which they're required to occupy. But in plastic form, they're not so squishy. And the pilot here is kind of a generic pilot, which is included in a lot of kits. So his feet make him ever so slightly too long because they press up against the rudder pedals. So all I'm going to do, if I can find my snips, is cut his feet away, just so we've got a little bit more room to play in. It doesn't matter that he's got no feet, because you're not going to be able to see the fact he hasn't got feet. So now he's in there, he actually fits much better in his chair. So I'm going to put some glue in his chair, and you can see that obviously we've painted in there, so I'm going to remove a little bit of the paint just to give a better bonding surface for the glue. Put some glue in there, pilot goes in, and there he is. So that's a much better position than he was in before. As before, his head was way too high. Now his head is much lower, so you can see that's a much better seated position for him. Now that's done, we need to go and put our cockpit assembly inside of our fuselage. So once again, we've painted inside of there, so if you want to remove some paint from the various bonding surfaces, so it's like just here and here, and I think there was some along here as well, then that will help. So a bit of cement there, and a bit of cement there, just to help it go in. Naturally, I've not been particularly careful there with the glue application, but you can be as careful as you like. Use a toothpick if you fancy it, and just make sure that that goes in the right place. Make sure everything's level and seated correctly. There should be some little slots, little grooves along the edge on the back there, where it slots into to keep it in the right place. So just manipulate it around a little bit to make sure it actually is in the right place as the glue dries. So now with that in place, we're going to test fit the other fuselage half. It goes onto that one. It has little mounting points. They're little like pins which go into holes, and you just need to check that everything lines up correctly. If it doesn't, then there's probably something wrong. It's probably the inside parts. They just need moving around a little bit just to get them in the exactly right place. It's like the old rhyme, don't blame the kit, always test fit. But yeah, that looks like it will go together quite well. So we need to very carefully, minimal amount of glue. Make sure you don't get any in our mounting point for our prop. So just start off down here, a small amount of glue, run it along the edges there. That's probably too much. I've gone a bit excessive. Use your cocktail stick. I'm just doing this for speed. A little bit of glue, run it along your edges. And don't forget to add some on the cockpit parts we've already done, because they need to be glued into the wall. And then don't forget to put your propeller assembly in, because it should freely rotate, so make sure there's no cement in those areas. And then it's a little bit fiddly, but it's a matter of just lining everything up and holding it together whilst the cement cures. A little bit extra, just move it out the way. Just be careful you don't leave any thumbprints or fingerprints on the model as you go. And yeah, that is as far as we're going to go for episode 1 of this Build With Me series. In the next episode, we'll focus on completing the rest of this aircraft. And it shouldn't take too long because we're almost, I'd say, like 50, 60% of the way towards having a completed plane sitting in front of us. Just make sure you let me know down in the comments what you thought of this build. Are you building along with me? And have you decided on whether you want to have your wheels down or your wheels up? I'm probably going to go wheels down so I can display it like that. But if you want to go wheels up, that is absolutely fine too, because you can have it flying around. As always, quick shout out to my channel members and patrons. Massive thanks to these guys on screen for the support they give my channel. If you'd like to join them, take a look at the links in the description. If you enjoyed this one, dropping a like would be greatly appreciated. And if you're new here, subscribing with notifications on will mean you never miss a modelling upload. Finally, all that's left to say is a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you on the workbench again next time.